Hello again and welcome back as we continue our journey through this exhaustive look at the creation-evolution debate. We've been focusing on the world-famous fossil cliffs of Joggins in Nova Scotia, Canada, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and relating it all to the global flood described in Genesis. We've been focusing on the numerous polystrate fossil plants found here and their challenges to the idea of deep time, that the layers represent millions of years. Obviously, the top of the plant isn't going to stick around for millions of years while it slowly gets buried. We addressed the idea that these plants were buried where they grew, showing how that is flatly impossible based on the evidence, and that at least thousands of feet of sedimentary layers were laid down at the same time based on the crushed and squished fossils, which were buried and squished while they were still green. But it gets more interesting. Here's a group of Calamites fossils. I've highlighted them because they're very hard to see in photographs. What especially does not show up in photographs is that they are all bent in unison in a helical spiral corresponding to their stratolines. Horsetail reeds do not grow in a spiral. They grow very straight. And remember, these are hollow reeds. They are a tube. Very similar to bamboo. If you try and bend a tube, it doesn't bend, it kinks. Unless you support the tube in a round shape while you bend it. These fossil horsetail reeds were bent well beyond the point of kinking. Yet they are still round, indicating that they were supported by the surrounding sediments while they were bent. In fact, the surrounding sediments were still soft, and the plants were obviously still green and not coalified or petrified because they bent. In fact, it would have been the sediments that applied the bending force to the plants and not, say, water. Because if the plants were buried to a certain point and a strong water force was pushing against the stalk of the plant would kink. The fossil plants are bent well beyond the kinking point. So it would appear that the sediments were still soft, and while the plant was still green, the sedimentary layers moved slightly relative to each other as you go up the stack of layers. Now, there's really only one time this would have happened, and that would have been during the tectonic activity that tilted the entire 20,000 foot thick stack of layers on an angle to the south. Obviously, this tilting tectonic activity happened after all 20,000 feet of sedimentary layers were laid down, because all of the layers from the top to the bottom tilted together. So the sequence of events was 20,000 vertical feet of sedimentary layers were originally laid down horizontally, burying all kinds of fossils within those layers. And before the plants had a chance to rot or turn to coal or stone, before the sediments had a chance to turn from mud into stone, the entire stack was also tilted about 20 degrees to the south. During this tilting, the sedimentary layers didn't just tilt, but also subtly rotated relative to each other, bending the polystrate plants, which were still green during this event. And it wasn't just this small group of Calamites plants to which this happened. I noticed this strange phenomenon of polystrate plants bent in a helical spiral consistently in the same direction when crossing stratigraphic horizons. let's take another look at that pair of polystrate lycopods I showed you a couple of lectures ago. Now, while both plants had extensive roots still preserved, the top upright one exhibited that negative geotropism that Harold Coffin pointed out. So this one long root goes down stratigraphically, then bends up again, crossing stratigraphic horizons. Now, it's difficult to make out in two-dimensional photographs, but take a close look. As the root descends stratigraphically, it also bends in a spiral away from the camera, back into the cliff. As it levels out and starts to ascend through the strata, it bends towards the camera. Simultaneously, the root from the inverted stump underneath it does not ascend or descend in the strata. It is horizontal and also perfectly straight. So if you were to look down at this stump and the roots from above, you would see that the roots were bent in a corkscrew shape in a left-hand spiral, a helix. So it would appear that the sediments were moving in different polar directions relative to each other. So let's take our tube example again, and hopefully you can picture this. So let's call this the bottom strata as the reference strata. The next sedimentary layer up is moving relative to the first with a polar heading clockwise relative to the last layer. So it will subtly bend the plant in this direction at this level. The next layer up is moving relative to the last in a clockwise polar heading, even farther than the last. So the plant will bend in this direction. The next layer up also moves in a direction slightly clockwise from the last layer, bending the plant with it. Each layer higher in the strata moves in a slightly different polar heading in a slight clockwise direction from the last. Once it has bent the plant in one direction, though, it now tries to bend that plant some more, but in so doing, it is now twisting the entire trunk. Now, this may sound outlandish to some of you, but let me point out how that is exactly what has happened to Joggins and in other polystrate fossil locations I've looked at in North America. When I first stumbled upon the group of Calamites bent horizontally in 2002, I didn't yet realize what I was seeing. I knew it was significant, but didn't realize the extent to which I would find this phenomenon. Now, Michael Rigel had happened to snag this photograph of a polystrated Joggins that year. Notice the split in the fossil trunk. The trunk has been split in a clockwise ascending spiral, evidence that the trunk has actually been dramatically twisted. I snagged this photo of the same trunk the following summer. The front portion of the trunk had fallen off due to the continual erosion, and this revealed the inner xylem of the plant. But look at this. The xylem has also been twisted in a clockwise ascending spiral. The entire trunk and inner core has been dramatically twisted. But wait, as was already previously pointed out, when you encounter polystrate plants at Joggins, there's usually bunches of them all on the same strata. Now, in general, this is true, and such is the case here. Stepping back from the cliffs, Here is where I found that first trunk I just showed you. As you follow the strata in which it is embedded, there are other polystrate trunks as well, which I've marked here in the panoramic photo. If this trunk was truly twisted by the sedimentary layers moving relative to each other, then all of those trunks should also be twisted as well. After all, they are all encased in the same sedimentary layers, right? Well, take a look for yourself. Even though they were spread out laterally over hundreds of feet, they were all twisted in the same direction. Now, this is all original research and there's far too much to cover here. Plus, I don't want to bore you all to tears. So I'll sum it up quickly. In documenting the possible twisting of polystrates, I've documented hundreds of polystrate fossils, of which about half of them were exposed enough to be able to assess for this, twisting and spiraling. Sometimes it was difficult to assess because the plants were damaged or destroyed, or they were very high in unstable cliffs, leading to a lower confidence in the analysis. However, taking into account the lack of confidence in some of the assessments, that still left somewhere between 50 to 80% of them exhibiting twisting in a clockwise ascending helical spiral in the trunks, branches, roots, and even the xylem. Some 10% exhibited spiraling in the opposite direction, while the remainder did not show any clear evidence of spiraling. But the plants that did exhibit bending all shared the same bending direction and distance on the same stratigraphic planes when there was other polystrate plants present. So we can confidently conclude they all bent at the same time after burial. These plants were bent while they were still green, had not yet rotted, had not yet turned to coal, and while the sediments were still soft. The sediments had to have shifted relative to each other in order to cause this effect. And the most logical time that would have happened would have been the tectonic upheaval that tilted all 20,000 vertical feet of layers to the south. Mountain experts Cliff Ollier and Colin Payne, in their book, The Origin of Mountains, spent their entire book documenting dozens of reasons why they conclude that all of the major mountain ranges on planet Earth were all formed at the same time. Hold up. So what they are saying, and with many, many good reasons, enough reasons to fill an entire book, what they are saying is that all of the mountain ranges on Earth, the Rockies, the Appalachians, the Swiss Alps, the Andes, the Himalayas, and yes, even all the mountains on the east coast of Canada, all rose up at the same time. On the east coast of Canada, it would have been during this worldwide mountain building event when all of the major mountain ranges on Earth rose up at the same time that tilted the 20,000 feet of layers, subsequently twisting the fossil plants within those sedimentary layers that formed these mountain ranges. So, the fossil plants of Joggins aren't just polystrate, but exhibit consistent twisting of the roots, branches, trunks, even the xylem, indicating that not only was all 20,000 vertical feet of sediments and fossils laid down over months at absolute most, but within that time period, Earth experienced major tectonic upheaval which formed all the major mountain ranges at the same time, and was presumably also the dividing of the continents. And yes, the continental division happened fast. We'll see the evidence for just how fast, and it actually, I believe, ties in with these twisted fossil plants. By the way, did you know that the whole idea of continental division was originally a creationist idea? Antonio Snyder Pellegrini was reading his Bible where it states, "And all the waters under the heaven were gathered unto one place." By implication, he concluded the land must also be in one place. Antonio thought this was an unusual comment, as all the land was not in one place on the earth now, and so he proposed that the continents split up from one original gigantic landmass, presumably at the time of the Great Flood of Noah. Antonio Snyder Pellegrini then published this drawing in 1858, proposing a fit of the continents and pointing to matching fossils on these continents as supporting his idea. This was 57 years before Alfred Wegener popularized the same idea, and the old Earth advocates hijacked this biblical idea, irrationally threw millions of years at it, to turn it around and claim that it scientifically demonstrates the Bible was false. Who'd have thought? The reason all of this is important is, again, it relates to the age of the Earth. With polystrate fossils, we are no longer discussing how to explain away a few mere tens of feet of rock layers with millions of years. We are now talking about having to explain away some 20,000 vertical feet of rock layers and fossils that were all laid down rapidly and experienced apocalyptic global tectonic upheaval, all within a time period of months at most. There is no millions of years involved here, anywhere. And if you remove the millions of years from Earth's history and replace it all with a catastrophic global flood, then the theory of evolution is tossed out the window because it requires those millions of years. Now, you remember those rock layers we find all over the world that everyone originally believed were deposits from the worldwide flood of Noah? Well, we find polystrate fossils literally all over the world in those layers. And sometimes it is fossil trees buried polystrate as well. We find polystrate fossil plants in France, Germany, England, Scotland, Australia, all over North America, for example, Alaska, Tennessee, all over Pennsylvania, Yellowstone National Park, on the border of Colorado and New Mexico, Colorado, and of course, all over the eastern seaboard of Canada. Now, these examples I give are, of course, only plants. We'll get into other types of polystrate fossils later, but to say the least, this is not a rare phenomenon. Now, before we go farther, I should explain some things relating to that global flood which may not be immediately evident. The flood would have been staggeringly huge. We watched awestruck as tsunamis hit Indonesia in 2004 and Japan in 2011. Now, while these floods would pale in comparison to the global flood of Noah's day, they certainly shed some light on some of the events and processes of a global flood. You see, many anti-creationists try to portray the global flood of Noah as happening overnight, which is not at all what is described in the Bible. As pointed out by Barrick and Sigler in their 2003 ICC paper, the grammar of the original Hebrew in Genesis 7 implies that the great flood of Noah started the day he and his family entered into the ark. The waters rose for 40 days before even getting high enough that Noah's ark began to float. So just under 6 weeks, the floodwaters rose until enough land had flooded to reach and float the Ark of Noah. The rain and waters continued to rise for 150 days, 5 months, when the floodwaters finally covered the highest mountain. The waters began to recede at 226 days when the first mountaintops were exposed and receded completely by day 371 when the Ark's occupants disembarked. While truly catastrophic, the great flood of Genesis did not happen overnight. It was an entire year of dramatic processes. Now, currently, our ocean levels go up and down twice a day. Why? Well, because of the tides, right? Gravitational forces, primarily from the moon, but also the sun, pull on the ocean waves, raising them in a tidal wave that travels around the world on both sides of the planet. So you get a tidal wave every 12 hours. If we have a global flood, in other words, all the land on the planet is submerged under the ocean, will we have tides? Well, of course we will. The gravitational pull is still there, pulling on the water. As a matter of fact, as my late and great good friend Professor M.E. Clark and his student Dr. Henry Voss pointed out way back in a 1990 paper, right now the tidal waves are stopped by the continents, land above the water. As shown in computer modeling, the moment that land is submerged below the ocean, the tidal wave becomes resonant. It gets bigger on every pass around the globe. So taking this all into account, here's my fancy schmancy graphics of the pre-flood world, the oceans and the hills. The flood begins, and for the next several months, the waters get higher and higher. Superimposed on those continually rising floodwaters would have been the tides. So the first tidal wave would encroach upon the land, laying down a layer of sediments. During low tide, the water would recede off the land. The next tidal wave would come in. However, because the floodwaters are rising, it would be higher than the last tidal wave. So it would lay down another layer of sediments on top of the last one. During low tide, the water recedes. So these tidal waves would be very much like the tsunamis we've all seen from Indonesia and Japan, only probably smaller in height and happening pretty rhythmically every 12 hours or so. During tidal recession, you can get things like uprooted trees or the giant reeds beaching on the freshly deposited sediments. The next tidal wave, bringing in fresh sediments, further buries the plants from the previous wave. The next tidal wave comes in, again higher than the last, and lays down another sedimentary layer. This process continues for weeks to months, with the tidal waves actually getting bigger and bigger as more and more of the continents are submerged and the oceans getting bigger. During low tides, animals like the dinosaurs and even humans would race across the newly formed tidal flats, trying to get from high ground to higher ground, foraging for food, etc. During these times, they would leave footprints in the mud of these freshly laid sedimentary layers. The next tidal wave that comes in lays down more sedimentary layers, burying and preserving these footprints, and sometimes dead animals and humans, eventually becoming fossils. The waters continue to rise with the tidal cycling superimposed on them, continually laying down new sedimentary layers until the highest mountains of the day were covered. The Bible actually refers to them as high hills, indicating that there were apparently no major mountains before the flood. Much more on that coming up, but for the moment, the highest mountains were covered on the 150th day. The water stayed covering the land for some time, during which multiple forces, including these resonant tides, would have moved the floodwaters at speed, causing powerful erosion action on the currently submerged continents. Now, obviously, we're not underwater now. So the water left the land. And not many people realize that this event of the water leaving the continents was just as significant as the water covering the land. It was this event of the waters leaving the continents which would have carved major canyons and major geomorphological features, which we will look at in detail over the next several lectures. As the Bible implies in Psalms 104 verse 8, the mountains rose up out of the floodwaters at the end of the great flood. I felt it was important to take the time to explain the hows and whys of the flood events so you can start to understand why a global flood best explains the rock layers and fossils we see all over the world, including those at the Joggins Fossil Cliffs.
Coming up in the next Complete Creation.
So the anti-creationists point to fossil dinosaur tracks in the fossil record and point out that we creationists would claim that these layers were made by the flood, to which I agree. They then mockingly build up a straw man saying, so did the dinosaurs walk on the bottom of the ocean or something? No, you bonehead, these are tidal flats, with the footprints being made while the tides were receding. Plus, those numerous polystrate trees buried upside down, cutting through multiple layers of dinosaur tracks, would clearly indicate that the multiple layers of dinosaur tracks were not made season after season, but rather the layers and thus the fossil dinosaur footprints themselves were made in catastrophic flood conditions.
You can catch the entire series in a variety of ways. You can watch the show online at www.completecreation.org or www.genesisweek.com. You can also purchase the Complete Creation series in full high definition on Blu-ray or video on demand at completecreation.org. Or support the Miracle Channel with a monthly tax-deductible donation and access the entire Complete Creation series in high definition through Corco, Miracle Channel's video on demand service. We need your support to keep this program on the air. So please pray for us. And if you wish to financially support the program, Canadians can make a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, K2K2P4. Or you can make a donation via PayPal online at ianjuby.org/donations. And thank you for your support.